From WHQR Public Media, this is The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schachman. Thanks for joining us. On today's show, I'm looking back at 2 years of reporting from my colleague Rachel Keith about the new Hanover County Schools Turnaround Task Force, a group formed to help improve the district's lowest performing schools. We'll look at what they've accomplished over the last 2 years, some big takeaways from their final report, and what's next for the group. But first, WHQR's Nikolai Mather recently interviewed North Carolina Representative Ted Davis about his PFAS legislation. If passed into law, it would make polluters like Chemours pay for the cost of clean drinking water. And Davis has tried and failed to pass bills like this before, but it looks like the third time might be the charm. This past November, WHQR hosted 2 candidate forums alongside our colleagues at WECT and Port City Daily. One of those forums featured state representatives Ted Davis and Frank Eiler, who answered journalist and audience questions about their voting records. Now, Davis and Eiler have been in state politics for a long time, and they're both staunch Republicans. So we were a little surprised to hear them take aim at the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce that night. When questioned about his response to PFAS pollution in the Cape Fear River, Davis said he had been trying to get a law passed on the issue for years, but hadn't been able to because the chamber opposed it. And Davis was a state rep back in 2017 when the news first broke that chemical manufacturer Chemours was polluting the Cape Fear River with PFAS and had been doing so for decades. The North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, has since entered into a consent agreement with Chemours that makes the company cover the cost of providing clean water to private well water users. But for public utilities, like the Cape Fear Public Utility Authority in Wilmington, or H2Go in Brunswick County, or the county itself in Brunswick, the costs of filtering out the potentially cancer-causing chemicals have been passed on to ratepayers. And that is what Davis has been trying to change. He wanted to pass legislation that would force companies like Chemours to pay for the cleanup, basically the cost of filtering our drinking water. He introduced a bill this session that would do exactly that, House Bill 569, the PFAS Pollution and Polluter Liability Act. This is the third time Davis has proposed this kind of legislation. What's different this time? Davis says he believes he thinks he can get more of his fellow GOP members on board. Here's what Representative Ted Davis shared in an interview with my colleague Nikolai Mather.
All right, thank you so much for joining us, sir. So, first up, tell us about this bill.
Well, to begin with, as I'm sure you know, we are finding more and more PFAS all over the state. Excuse me, what this bill does, really, it makes liability on manufacturers, and we can go into what that means, of PFAS materials that make their way into a water source, and that water makes its way into a public utility. And it's going to concentrate more than the maximum level of allowable PFAS. And as a result of that, the public utility has to spend exorbitant amounts of money in order to get the equipment necessary to relieve that pollution. Well, unfortunately, as we've seen in New Hanover County and Brunswick County and soon to be Cumberland County, the public utility rates have been raised to cover the cost of what it takes to get the equipment necessary to remove that pollution. And I didn't think, and still don't think, and will never think, that it's right for the ratepayers to have to pay that money to remove the pollution that the polluters put in there, and they don't have liability for nothing.
So this bill would make polluters cover the costs associated with cleaning up PFAS pollution. Does that mean any cost from now forward, or would it also secure reimbursement for past expenses as well, like for Brunswick County's reverse osmosis plant or New Hanover County's GAC filters?
Let me give you an example. In New Hanover County, from June of 2017, that's when PFAS was first discovered, but from that point up to March 31 of this year, Cape Fear Public Utility Authority has spent $82,849,988 in ratepayer funds to address the Chemours. Well, I'll say Chemours because they're the only plant in the region, or in the state for that matter, that we know of that manufactures PFAS from scratch in their process for what they make. So, and what that has meant is a 10% increase in every monthly bill for the average ratepayer. And one thing this bill does that I really like putting it in there was, let's say that a polluter or a manufacturer of PFAS is found liable for the cost. If any money is collected by the utility authority or DEQ or whatever, it goes back to the ratepayers. And the bill does go back, it's retroactive to 2017. And I've had a lot of questions about, well, why is it retroactive to 2017? And that's to answer the exact question that you asked. And that is, starting in 2017 was the first time we knew what was going on or discovered what was going on, learning more and more about it. And so why should not a PFAS manufacturer be liable? And realize too, this was going on at Chemours a long time before 2017. And they knew what they were doing. And they didn't do anything until they got caught. I know when I've been presenting this bill in Raleigh, a representative of Chemours has been there saying, oh, we've done this, oh, we've done that. And I said, yeah, when you got caught. So I think it's only right that if any money is recouped from that polluter, that it should go back to the ratepayers. I think that's the right thing to do. And that's something in this bill that I really like.
You say if any money is recouped from the polluters. Is that not a guarantee with this bill?
No, I mean, you can't guarantee anything. There are three main factors they'd have to determine. One would be that the entity that you're going after, the polluter, made the PFAS from scratch. They're the original maker of the PFAS substance. Number two, if that substance was introduced in the environment, and then if it goes into that public utility, and if it's above that rate of the allowable concentration, then they're liable. But the secretary can notify the polluter of this, but you've got to be able to prove the fact that they have in fact polluted the water. I mean, it's just not an automatic. And if that is done, then they can order monetary damages. And if the polluter does not abide by what the secretary finds, then the secretary of DEQ can sue the polluter. And then the polluter can go to court, and the polluter can certainly defend themselves saying, well, I didn't do it. This is not me. I'm not responsible for this. In other words, they would have an opportunity to defend themselves if they so choose. But also, it adds burden, in my opinion, on DEQ to be able to prove the fact that they were responsible for that pollution. I mean, there is a thing called due process, and you have to give those people the chance to abide by what the secretary finds or contest it if they deny it.
I see. So in the past, you've sponsored 2 other bills to hold polluters responsible for the costs associated with PFAS pollution. I believe the first one was 2022 and the second one was 2024. Can I ask what happened to those bills?
Absolutely. The first bill I filed was 3 sessions ago, and it never made it very far. To give you a brief history, there was an environmental review committee that met in Wilmington. It was from both chambers, and it met in Wilmington for the first time to ask questions and try to find out about what is PFAS? What is this whole thing going on? And I spoke and others spoke. And after that, quite frankly, you had the Senate and the House in that committee. And it took the chairs from both chambers to agree to have a meeting. Well, the Senate at that time, chairman said, oh, we're not going to meet anymore. We're not going to do it. So that upset me quite a lot. So I went to the Speaker of the House at that time, Tim Moore. And I told him, I said, look, we've got this serious problem in Wilmington, and I think it's going to affect other areas of the state as well. And we form a committee to really look into this and find out what it is we're talking about, because nobody really knew. And he said yes. So he made me chairman, and it was called the North Carolina River Quality Committee. And we had toxicologists come in, we had scientists come in, DEQ to come in, all these experts. And we really learned a whole lot about what PFAS were. Where I'm going with this, the bill originally did not get that far because at that point, it wasn't as big a deal as it is now statewide. A lot of people just didn't realize what was going on. And that's why that committee was so important, because we had Republicans on it, we had Democrats on it, and we were all learning about this. But once again, there just was not consensus among the majority of the Republicans at that time to move forward on the bill. Some of that, quite frankly, was of mistrust with DEQ, because at that point, DEQ would not only set the contaminant standards, they would also enforce that. And the thought was, well, now you're just giving one entity too much authority, too much power. So it never really got even to the committee.
That was my colleague Nikolai Mather speaking with Republican State Representative Ted Davis. They're talking about Ted Davis's past PFAS legislation, which would try to force PFAS manufacturers to be responsible for cleanup costs. Now we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll hear more about Davis's other attempts to pass PFAS legislation and the pushback he's been facing from members of his own party, as well as business advocacy groups here in North Carolina. I'm Ben Schachtman. You're listening to The Newsroom. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schachtman. Thanks for staying with us. Earlier in the show, we heard my colleague Nikolai Mather speaking with Republican State Representative Ted Davis. Davis, who represents part of New Hanover County in the North Carolina House, has been trying to pass a bill that would make PFAS manufacturers like Chemours pay for cleanup costs, specifically the costs of filtering our drinking water. Right now, it's ratepayers who pay for that. Now, Davis has tried to pass a law like this several times, first in 2022 and again in 2024, and we'll hear more about that in just a moment. And Davis says he's faced major opposition from members of the GOP and from pro-business lobbyists who say that holding Chemours accountable is bad for business. Davis disagrees. Okay, let's get back to the interview.
How did it go during the 2024 session?
So the next session, I was going to be like a pit bull. I was going to keep gnawing until we finally got this thing heard. So the next session, I filed it. The Republicans met together. We discussed it. But still, there were questions and unknowns about all of this. It first went to my Judiciary Committee. I'm chairman of the Senior Judiciary 1 Committee, so they assigned it to my Judiciary Committee. And that was the first time we really had a public discussion about it. That is where I learned that the North Carolina Chamber was adamantly against it, which really surprised me. And also NC Free, which is a business alliance, was against it. And that really upset me, the fact that they would speak out against it. Chemours was there and spoke out against it. Of course, I realized that. They're not going to sit there and admit liability, for something they had clearly done for all these years. But the two chairmen of the Environment Committee at that time, after we heard it in the Judiciary, were not agreeable to pushing it forward in the environment. One in particular, because that person had a lot of questions about it, wasn't comfortable with DEQ's involvement with it, so it didn't go anywhere. This time, which was, 3 times is, what is it? 3 times is the charm?
3 times the charm, yeah.
So there's a thing called a proposed committee substitute, PCS, which if you have a bill, you can go in and change that bill and add things to it. It's a little more extensive than an amendment to a bill. Actually, the PCS would take over from the original bill. So last session, I had actually done a PCS to help address some of the concerns that I had been told that Republican members of the House had with the bill, but I never got to introduce it because we ran out of time. So what I did this time is I started out with that PCS, and I've made a couple of clarifications with it. And what I want to continue to do is I'm reaching out to representatives that I know might have an objection to it, to find out what are those objections and what would it take to make you comfortable with proceeding with the bill. The Democrats, I feel like, are very much in support of it. As a matter of fact, on this bill, and I hope I'm not rambling too much, but on this bill, I thought it was very important to show bipartisan support and also support from those that are really affected by this PFAS pollution. And so what I did, you can have 4 primary sponsors on a bill. What I did, of course, I'm from New Hanover County. Frank Eiler, who represents Brunswick County, and let me just interject if I may, in Brunswick County, they have spent $158.7 million for an expansion and low pressure reverse osmosis treatment for PFAS. And that equates that rates have gone up 40% to cover the cost of the upgrades. So I thought it was important to show Brunswick County part of this bill. I also thought it was important for Cumberland County because Cumberland County's public utility is getting ready to start working on what they need to have to remove the PFAS from their drinking water. It's estimated to be $92 million. And it has already been said by them that all costs are going to go back to the ratepayers. So Diane Wheatley is a representative from Cumberland County. So I asked her to be on the bill. And then to show bipartisan support, I asked the minority leader, Robert Reeves, if he would be willing to be a primary sponsor on this bill. And he said, yes, sir. And so that is very important because it shows that this bill has the support of the Democrats as well as Republicans. Maybe that's more than what you wanted to know as far as answering your question. But I just think it's very important that people understand that this problem is not political. I mean, it affects Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated, people that don't have any party, political party, anybody, everybody. Men, women, children, adults, the whole thing.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, too, you mentioned that the Chamber of Commerce wasn't very supportive the first 2 times around. Are they more receptive to the bill now?
That's an excellent question. Like I said, when that legislation was first passed in my Judiciary Committee years ago, that was the first I ever heard about the Chamber being against it, or NC Free, the Business Alliance, being against it. And I was really surprised because they said it was anti-business. And I said, well, number one, I said the Chamber recognizes legislators on an annual basis if they are pro-business. They're called business champions. I've been one every year I've been here. The NC Free every 2 years recognizes legislators that are pro-business, based upon their votes and bills that they've sponsored or co-sponsored. I've gotten that award every year that they've done it. And so I told them at that meeting, I said, how can you sit there and say that I'm anti-business when y'all have given me this recognition ever since I've been up here? The message they were giving me is that what business would want to come here if they knew that they could be liable for polluting our water? Well, my response to that was, well, how many companies do you think want to come here if they know that their employees, their families don't have clean drinking water? So I don't buy that argument. As far as this time, it finally got to the Environment Committee, this session. I mean, it did go to the Environment Committee and it got a favorable report. I'm so tickled. I mean, that is a huge step, something I've been working on for 5 years to have that hearing in the Environment Committee. They did allow people that had signed up to speak, and the only one that spoke in the time that was left was someone from Comoros. I didn't see or hear anybody from the Chamber. I'm not meaning to say they might not have been there or whatever. And maybe the fact that I made such a big deal out of the fact that they are not supporting it, that they're being quiet. I don't know. I think they're going to be working behind the scenes. And I also think, I know Comoros will be working behind the scenes to try to convince legislators not to pass this legislation. I wish I was wrong on the Chamber side. Now, we've got a local business alliance, the K-Fair Business Alliance in Wilmington. They support the bill because they understand it's not anti-business.
Yeah. Well, just to wrap things up, you mentioned that the bill has gone to committee. Do you think that there's a chance that we'll see it on the House floor sometime soon?
So since this bill has an appropriation in it, I'm not bound by having to get it done by the crossover date, which is coming up. There are tons of other bills that I'm hearing in my committees and others as well that are subject to crossover. So we're concentrating on them first.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk to the rules chair for the House, who's responsible for bills moving, and see if they want to try to go forward before the crossover day, or let's wait till after the crossover day. But either way, I'm going to continue on and do everything I can to get this bill heard and hopefully passed in the House this session, which will not end at least until the end of June, if not longer. So we have plenty of time.
You've been listening to my colleague Nikolai Mather talking with Republican State Representative Ted Davis about the PFAS Pollution and Polluter Liability Act. Davis has tried to pass bills like this before, but they've always died in committee on what's known as crossover day. That's the General Assembly's self-imposed deadline when most legislation must make it out of one chamber and into the other, or essentially be considered dead. This year, the General Assembly crossover day was Thursday, May 8th. And on that day, Davis called the WHQR team with some exciting news. The bill had passed in the House with a vote of 104 to 3. Davis did have to make a couple of adjustments to the legislation to get it through. First, he removed the bill's appropriations in order to get it through before the crossover deadline. You'll recall in the interview he said appropriations bills don't usually get taken up until after crossover day. Second, the bill now has a cost threshold. The burden on ratepayers from cleanup must now exceed $50 million. Davis told WHQR, yes, that is a high figure, but one that New Hanover, Brunswick, and Cumberland County have all exceeded. The final change is that any company subject to this bill has to have entered into a consent order, quote, that established required compliance measures with PFAS discharge. That also narrows the scope, but even with that change, Chemours, the primary PFAS manufacturer in North Carolina, would apparently still be subject to the bill. There's still a long road ahead. The bill has to make it through the state Senate, and Davis told WHQR that the Chamber of Commerce is still working to convince legislators to vote against his bill. But after 5 years of attempts, he said he's excited to see the bill finally moving forward. All right, well, we need to take a quick break. But when we come back, I'll be sitting down with my colleague Rachel Keith to take a look at what the New Hanover County Schools Turnaround Task Force has accomplished over the last 2 years and what's in store for them in the future. I'm Ben Schockman. You're listening to The Newsroom. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schockman. Thanks for staying with us. In the summer of 2023, New Hanover County Schools formed a task force to address consistently low scores at 12 schools around the district. The state gives individual schools performance grades, and these schools were all getting D's or F's. The task force convened 16 people to try and dig into the socioeconomic and psychological backstory of the situation and start compiling best practices, some potential solutions for the problems ailing about a quarter of our schools. Flash forward 2 years, and the task force is wrapping up its work as a school committee and delivering a final report. But the people involved say there's still plenty of work to do, so the task force may well live on in a different form. Here to unpack what that task force has accomplished and what's next for them is my colleague, Rachel Keith. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so for the last 2 years, you have been covering the New Hanover County Schools Turnaround Task Force, formed to help put a spotlight and look for solutions for the district's lowest performing schools. And now that Turnaround Task Force is sort of disbanding as a official school committee, and we'll get into what the future might hold. But we wanted to take some time for this episode of the Newsroom to look at what the discussion has been and what they've accomplished. So you recently spoke with Scott Wisnant and Stephanie Walker, who's now a county commissioner. They're members of the task force, and Wisnant was talking about there are 3 possible choices that are on the table now that the district could pursue to deal with some of these low-performing schools. So help break this down for us.
Yes, at the end of the day, there are 3 options, according to Wisnant. That is, One, you're going to continue with the neighborhood school model, which means you go to the school, which is in your neighborhood or closely aligning with that. And at this rate, about 25% of schools kind of fall behind the others because, as we know, neighborhoods sometimes reflect socioeconomic status. And so that is our current model that we're dealing with. So that's the status quo. Second is to redistrict the schools so that they do look similar to one another instead of concentrating poverty in certain schools. And that wouldn't cost as much money as the third option, which would be to put millions of extra dollars into these schools to kind of catch them up and to get more adults to help support kind of the learning gaps that started at an early age. And so this is what Scott said about the task force's work.
And what we're trying to do is the third one. The second one is something that politically we can't do. And the first one is something morally we can't do.
So I think what Wisnet is saying here is the status quo is morally unacceptable, at least to a lot of members of the task force. We're just leaving behind a quarter of the district schools to just have low performance scores. That's not something we can do. And redistricting has met with a lot of resistance, sort of irrespective of party. When we saw the school board with a strong Democratic presence on it, redistricting didn't go forward. We've got a Republican majority now. Redistricting isn't going forward. We do know from your reporting that the school has looked at sort of a consultancy, Cropper GIS, that sort of showed, hey, a lot of these problems could be solved by redistricting. You've got overcrowding at some of the schools in more affluent neighborhoods, undercrowding at some of the schools in the lower socioeconomic areas. And so it would cost some money, as you pointed out, to figure out the exact plan, but nothing like the costs of option 3, which, as your reporting has shown, would be that kind of additional in-class support to really try and get these kids caught up to speed.
And here's Wisnet again, and a lot of times they do give up on redistricting, but he has a caveat to that.
Let's get redistricting on the table here. That would be the quickest way to make sure every school had a majority of parents who value education, have means to support it, and that would change the culture in every school.
And Wisnet did say in their deliberations over the past couple years, and there's about 20 community members, a part of this task force in education and in political power, that we're talking about, we also cannot blame the parents solely. I mean, they're working 2 and 3 jobs, that they want to be there for their kids, and they are, but sometimes, their job demands or other things are drawing them away to help support children who need it. And he asked people to think about their own upbringing, like your parents were likely there for you or grandparents. And so all kids don't necessarily have that point of view. So we got to think about other ways to reach people. So the neighborhood school model we've been talking about. So Wisnet gives the background to this and what the effects on one specific school were because of it.
We as a community voted for neighborhood schools in 2006. 2005, Gregory was at the 85th percentile in North Carolina. We voted for neighborhood schools. Oh, let's have schools closer to where you live. We were told if you do that, you're going to create winners and losers schools because you'll create pockets of poverty. We stood by when they redistricted in 2010, and we've stood by ever since. We're all complicit in this, and that's what exactly the things we predicted would happen have happened. And by 2015, Gregory was at the 2nd percentile in North Carolina. If you're looking for someone to blame, it's us as a community. We watched this happen, and we didn't stop it.
And I will say that Gregory has recovered. They're basically in the 67th percentile right now. And, you'll talk to Superintendent Dr. Barnes and everybody on the task force. We know that, they say that there's good stuff happening in these schools. But again, the poverty and the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences that come with poverty, get concentrated, and that's still an issue. There is stigma sometimes behind some of these schools, which is unfair, but it is an issue when we'll talk about proficiency versus growth in these schools.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard is that, the media doesn't do as much as they could about the successes.
Yes.
And I think that's a fair complaint, but I also think I've heard from teachers and other experts that a lot of the stuff that could be fixed with lower levels of resources have been fixed. So there have been wins. They've been some of the easier wins. Some of the problems that are still in the schools, some of the schools that are still lower performing, will take more drastic changes or more significant investments to show improvement. All right, so moving on, you also spoke with Stephanie Walker. She's a county commissioner now, formerly a school board member. In fact, she's said publicly that the reason she ran for county commission was to sort of continue the work that she was doing on the school board. And she was telling you about sort of how she sees this issue of needing to invest more in the lower performing schools.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why she said she ran for school board in 2020. And she started this task force, and one of the reasons was also to look at the adverse childhood experiences that come in some of these schools. And the very first meeting, she gave her own story about how she dealt with ACEs as a child. And she had a lot of them, but she wanted to raise awareness of that issue, but then also to look more at the problem and to invest where the problem is.
The root that we always end up at is poverty all the time. And there has to be buy-in and investment. And I even made the point, you invest now or you pay later. And what do you want? We're doing a tremendous job attracting businesses here, and our growth is tremendous as well. But we can't leave students behind.
So, yeah, I think that's sort of where the task force has been at for a while, certainly at the end of 2 years, is these three options that Wisnet laid out. The first, which is the status quo, which they pretty much all agree is unacceptable. The second, which is politically difficult, which is redistricting, but not as expensive as really ramping up the resources for those lower performing schools. And I think also it's been interesting looking over the course of the task force 2 years. They had these 4 pillars. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, the 4 pillars that they wanted to improve was pre-K, so some degree of maybe universal preschool, a positive culture in every school, and literacy at all levels, and how the community shores up post-graduation plans for our students. And one of the members of the task force, Jane Morrow of New Hanover County Smart Start, she joined the group in the second year. And here's an example of investing in something that could change. And here are some of her ideas to invest in preschool and what our community could do.
So there are different kinds of policy things that can work. So some of it is more money into a subsidy system, which would make it more affordable for more families. Some of it might be setting some different minimum wages for early educators, having a salary supplement program similar to what we have in the county as a supplement to the state salaries for teachers. It could be looking for more ways for businesses to contribute.
And those policies that she's talking about, that would be money at all levels. That would be a county, state, federal funding that could help some of these policies work. And the last one she said, there's something interesting. There's a pilot right now in the state. It's called TriShare, where a third is paid by the business, a third is paid by the employee, and a third is paid by the state. So that helps shore up that workforce.
Right, and that is a way to help people afford childcare.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And preschool could be a part of that.
Absolutely, yeah, because right now, and you've got some reporting out this week, that is a difficult nut to crack.
That is.
Yeah. So you mentioned this before, and I want to dig a little deeper into this, is the whole point of the task force was to turn around low-performing schools. And we have heard some objections and some pushback about the way these schools are talked about and the way people think about these schools. There is some stigma to going to a low-performing school. We had Dorian Cromartie on the show a couple years ago talking about that very issue. And this is something the task force definitely delved into.
Yes, and right now, the way it stands is that there are school report card grades A to F. And so when they first started, there were 12 schools on the low-performing list, and now there's technically 6 from the last year's numbers. So there was a lot of contention between that discussion, between how well are they doing on the test and how well are they growing. And a lot of times the district would really root into the growth model because that's what they have more control over. But then some people outside of the schools would say, well, we need to also look at proficiency, both agree, camps agree that both are important, but one puts more emphasis on the other, and that was a continuous contention in this group.
Right, and for folks who don't follow this as closely, proficiency, these are annual tests that students take to see whether or not they're hitting like concrete benchmarks. We want you to get this grade on this test to make sure that you're on track. Whereas growth is how much did you improve from the previous year? And I think some of the pushback we heard was from teachers who, say you're a third grade teacher and you inherit the class from the previous year's second grade, which might have inherited from first grade. And these students are behind on their proficiency. They are not getting the grades that the state would like to see them get on their tests. And all of the fantastic teaching in the world, the best teacher with the best lesson plans, the most engaging people, just aren't going to be able to get every student to that level of proficiency, but they are going to generate growth. They are going to see those students improve. And so sort of vilifying those teachers for failing, quote unquote, to get students to that level of proficiency felt really unfair to those teachers and those schools as sort of a community. And so for people who just pointed at one, it felt like it was leaving out part of the picture. But on the other hand, as members of the school board have said, at a certain point, we got to graduate these kids. They are done after 12th grade. They get to
and they have to function in society and at a job.
So here's Scott Wisnett talking about this idea, this tension between proficiency and growth.
Or to put it more bluntly, compare it to learning to swim. 10 is I swim, 1 I'm afraid of the water. I get you from 1 to 3. You'll get in the water and duck your head. You know what you're going to do when you get in the deep end? You're going to drown because at some point you got to be proficient. However, that doesn't mean we live to teach to the test. We went through that last time. That doesn't mean everybody lives for that end of grade test. That's not a good way to run school.
So it is one component, but I mean, to reiterate, and these statistics were shared at the task force over and over again. So the final report that they are sending to the school board, it says, quote, Black children do not come within 46 points of any white ones on any elementary school EOG, and that's the average. Children receiving free or reduced lunch score 25 to 40 points lower than the overall student population. And basically it ends with, we are failing minority children, especially those in poverty. So we is not the teachers or the administration solely. This includes the community and the politicians with what we started with at the beginning about neighborhood schools.
And that's something that, Walker is talking about when she's talking about investing. She's talked about the incredible growth New Hanover County has seen. We are a wealthy community. And so a lot of members of the task force have found it particularly galling that with a community with this many resources, the endowment, Novant NHRMC's foundation, the sheer amount of money that comes off of the tax rolls, that with all of that at our disposal, that we can't seem to fix this problem. So that's part of the frustration that you've heard over the last 2 years.
That's right.
Okay, so as we've said, the task force is wrapping up in its current incarnation. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens now and what's next.
Yes. So here is Scott Wisnett talking about their future.
A task force, by definition, is a short-term proposition. Our goal was to inform the school board of what the issues are, what you could do about it, what it would cost. We've done that. We've sent them a report. We hope to be able to present on it in a public school board meeting. So from here, we're going to move into either our own nonprofit or live under the umbrella of something like communities and schools. And early education, preschool will be one of the major focuses, as will postgraduate.
And at a recent agenda review meeting, the chair of the school board, Melissa Mason, said that they would likely be presenting this final report to the board and the community in June. And I asked Scott Wisnett and Stephanie Walker, what if we're dealing with the same problems a decade from now? I mean, what's going to happen? And Scott responded to that.
It won't be by me. But we have a chance here to fix something that no one ever fixes. We have resources that no one ever has. Every community has this problem of schools, some schools, disparate schools. I think we have it in the most extreme manner, probably in North Carolina. So we're the perfect test case to do it. We've got the resources to do it.
So one of the things I've talked about with Scott Wisnett is that New Hanover County actually at one point had among, if not the lowest performing school and some of the highest performing schools in the whole state, here in the same county. So when he's talking about that disparity and it being more stark here than in other places, that's what he's getting at. And again, we have rattled off the list of resources that we have here. If anyone could crack this nut, as I've said, it could fix this problem, it should be us, is what Wisnat's saying. So let's talk a little bit about what the task force has gotten done over the last 2 years. Scott was saying part of our mission, our main mission, was to get the facts out, to lay out the problem and sort of show the school board what they needed to do. What else have they been up to?
Yes, they celebrated during the 2 years. Communities and schools of Cape Fear got two pretty big grants. One was to get a full service community model at Freeman, and they also got to expand their Freedom Schools, their summer school, to 3 additional schools than the ones they're already serving.
And we'll have some links under the page. A friend of the show, Kevin Maurer, did some reporting a couple years ago on what these Freedom Schools are and what the impact they have is.
That's right. So they counted that as a win. Wisnat also said that Snipes Elementary is poised to get the Leader in Me program that I believe the district has told me would be for about a year. And this is a program that teaches kids to be in leadership roles. And it's more of hitting the button of the positive school culture. And when you have a positive school culture, usually you see better performance in academics and in behavior. So that's really important. They really thought that they raised the awareness about the proficiency discussion and what you need to do to get there. They also raised awareness, they thought, of adverse childhood experiences and how those feed into low-performing schools, that sometimes those will be concentrated. And again, that's why you need additional support and coaches and mental health therapists to support the teachers that are dealing with a lot.
And I think that conversation was so important because it is really complicated and nuanced. And if you're not really engaged in that conversation, what it sometimes looks like what people are saying is that Black students are not doing as well, simply because they are Black. And that is the way it looks in demographic terms. But if you look at the concentrations of poverty, right, and you look at the socioeconomic history of the South, and specifically Wilmington and New Hanover County, it starts to make a lot more sense. And then if you look at what does it mean to have ACEs? What does it mean to be food insecure, housing insecure, to have only one parent, to have violence in your neighborhood? Concentrations of poverty often mean more violence. And you add all those things up and you look at the psychological impact on a kid. And then you look at what happens when you put many kids who are dealing with many ACEs in the same classroom. We've talked about the popcorn effect or the nuclear reactor effect, where you pull out the control rods and things get out of control. That is such a difficult task for a teacher. And every time they have to stop and calm a student down or figure out what's going on with them emotionally, that is another hitch in the process of teaching a class. And you multiply that day after day, week after week, semester after semester, you start to see how this whole thing is working. And that was not a conversation people were having publicly because it is a big, daunting, and at times touchy discourse, but it needed to happen. All right, so one other thing I wanted to note is that the Friends of Public Schools, this is something that Wisnat and a few others had put together. It's a new nonprofit, so it wasn't eligible for a New Hanover Community Endowment Grant, so they're operating under the umbrella of Community and Schools. That makes them eligible. And they've got a pretty significant ask to tackle another issue you've looked at, which is kind of the absence of parent-teacher groups at schools.
Yes, and I mean, my report from 2022 showed that the top performing fundraising elementary schools on average raise $74,000 a year. And then we have other schools that have $200 in their budget. So the absence of these PTAs really do have an impact on some of these schools. So the request was to get about $300,000 to spread among about 10 schools so that they can help do teacher appreciation lunches, to buy student supplies, to host field trips. So they want to fill the gap where the gaps are, because other schools are doing just fine with their PTAs. Other schools just do not have that community support because the parents are struggling. And so they can't really give like other parents can at other schools.
So the last thing I want to talk about here in terms of their accomplishments, which was giving the school board some numbers and some potential projects, real concrete ideas to work with.
Yes, and in the final report, there's about $18 million in requests, and that they separated out into what the district could ask for and then what the community as a whole could ask for. And again, we hear politicians say, how much is that going to cost? Well, they all costed it out right now. And so, for example, for the district, they should ask for about 14 behavioral specialists to work more with students and behavior and test-taking strategies and doing homework and getting to school on time. They also talked about getting multi-language family liaisons. There are high populations of English as a second language families, and there's that communication barrier that they sometimes have to work through. They want more coaches to help with behavior, and they're called safe and civil schools coaches. And in the community requests, it's more communities and schools specialists. They want some navigators that can help families navigate early education. Where do I go to preschool? How much is it going to cost? They're also looking into a future center that was in a prior report of mine about how you get students the 3 E's. It's either enlisted, enrolled, or employed. So they want to make sure that students, when they graduate high school, have a pathway. And so that is kind of an innovative idea that they came up with. So at this point, yes, they've had some wins. Yes, they've elevated the discussion. Yes, they've figured out sometimes what it would cost, but some of these have not been funded, and that's left to be determined in the next couple of years what the community decides to do.
Yeah, and again, to be clear, part of this is the district can only ask for so much. They are funded by the county, and they have to ask for something the county is going to be willing to fund, but there are all of these other players in town who have the ability to help support things. So getting more people involved in the conversation, instead of just saying this is all on the school board to come up with the ideas and it's all on the county to fund it, this is a much more complicated community-based approach.
Yeah, for example, this budget cycle, the superintendent asked for $4 million in extra support staff, one in each school, and they could decide if this is an AIG, a special education need, a behavioral coach. But, the county said they didn't have the funding, so they're now going to the endowment for that ask. So there's an example of that.
So to close this out, I want to touch on a little bit of cynicism that we hear sometimes when we talk about task force. It's sort of like the committee version of a strongly worded letter sometimes. Mm-hmm. And one member of the task force really addressed that that cynicism just dead on.
Yes, Elizabeth Redenbaugh of Coastal Horizon, she's been on the task force for 2 years, and she's a former school board member. And she's saying we like to admire the problem. So what are we going to do to actually fix the problem? And, some of these programs that have been put into place are getting there. Additional staff would get there. Less performing schools, they did do that over the year. So we're seeing things happen, but what they're advocating for, I think, are larger systemic changes. And will those happen? That's up to the political will in this town.
Well, it has been, I know, a lot of your time to do this reporting. You've done 12.5 articles, 4 newsrooms, and some segments here and there. You've really put a lot of energy into covering this, and I appreciate it. I know our listeners appreciate it. It's not the end of the story, but I do think we have gotten to the point where a lot of the task members feel like we have done the work, we have had the complicated, tough conversations, and we have given you a playbook. Now someone has to put their money where their mouth is and see if they can actually make the changes that they wanted to make.
That's right.
All right. Well, Rachel Keith, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of The Newsroom. Thanks to the guests who made time to appear on today's show. From the new Hanover County Turnaround Task Force, Scott Wisnant, County Commissioner Stephanie Walker, and from New Hanover County Smart Start, Jane Morrow. Thanks also to Representative Ted Davis. Thanks to my colleagues Nikolai Mather and Rachel Keith, and to WHQR's excellent technical team, Ken Campbell and Jonathan Furnell. Music for this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions and If These Trees Could Talk. If you missed any part of this program, you can find it at WHQR.org or get it as a podcast pretty much everywhere you can get podcasts. If you have comments, concerns, or just an idea for a future show, you can email us at newsroom@WHQR.org. I'm Ben Schachman. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for the next edition of The Newsroom.